Patrice Talon independent TBD presidential elections will be held in Benin on the 11th of April 2021. These elections will elect the President of the Republic of Benin to a 5-year term. Incumbent President Patrice Talon is seeking his second term in office. The 2016 presidential elections saw the election of Patrice Talon, who won in the second round of voting with nearly double the number of votes than his opponent, Lionel Zinsou, Prime Minister running under outgoing President Thomas Boni Yais Kauri forces for an emerging Benin party. Benin has a reputation for being a stable democracy on the African continent. Upon becoming president, Talon undertook swift economic reforms aimed at liberalization. This provoked protests and strikes in the country and later led to the government tightening regulations on public protests, which led to accusations of authoritarianism. In parallel, the president has attempted to combat corruption in the country. During the presidential campaign, Talon highlighted good governance as one of his key themes, including the introduction of a single presidential term, which he called a moral requirement. However, this reform was blocked by Parliament, who refused to create the precedent that a president could modify the constitutional terms of his mandate. The approval and reputation of President Talon was seriously damaged in the wake of the 2019 parliamentary elections, which saw the government drastically restrict the eligibility of political parties, with only 2 pro-government parties able to run, totally excluding any opposition parties, the Union Progressista and the Bloc Republicain. The 2 pro-government parties created for the election won all the seats in parliament, meaning no opposition movements would have a direct voice in legislative matters. Opposition parties called for a boycott of the election, which led to a record low 23% voter turnout, down from 65% in the previous election. The opposition again accused the president of authoritarianism and called for an end to the vote counting process and the organization of new elections without success. 2 days after the election, Amnesty International released a statement denouncing the wave of arbitrary arrests of political activists and journalists and the repression of peaceful protests. The election was also marked by a complete internet shutdown on the day of the vote, an action criticized by the opposition, civil society and international observers. The level of repression on the part of the government was described as alarming. The days following the election involved violent clashes between protesters and security forces, with the latter firing tear gas and live ammunition, while protesters burning tires and throwing various objects. Amnesty International denounced the death of 4 protesters as well as continued arbitrary arrests, which led to the serious injury of another protester. A strong security contingent was deployed on the streets of Cotonou and Porto Novo leading up to the investiture ceremony for the new assembly. Para-commandos, anti-riot vehicles, the CRS and units of the Republican Guard were all deployed to maintain order. Nevertheless, a 6-month political dialogue process led to an agreement on rules regarding electoral participation. During the 2020 municipal elections, only 5 political parties were validated by the Central Election Authority, down from 34 parties and alliances in the 2015 municipal elections. The Kauri Forces for an Emerging Benin was the only opposition party to exceed the 10% vote threshold needed for representation. This has led to some international observers questioning the strength of democracy in the country, which had previously been considered one of the most stable in Africa. Due to an increasing restrictive and authoritarian bent, a loss of political pluralism, and key political rivals of President Talon either in exile or excluded from political participation. As the 2021 elections approached, the incumbent president was seen as theoretically the only person able to run as a candidate. A 2019 revision to the constitution imposed a requirement that candidates need receive the nomination of 10% of the total MPs and mayors fear they will be designated as Trojan horses by President Talon. In April 2021, protests occurred in several Beninese cities in light of Talon's decision to stand for re-election after initially stating he would only serve for 1 term. Demonstrations were noted to have occurred in the commercial capital, Cotonou, as well as the city of Parakou in the center of the country. The president of Benin is elected by a two-round system to a 5-year term that is renewable once. If no candidate receives a majority of the vote in the first round, the top two candidates compete in a second round organized within 15 days of the first round. After a constitutional amendment adopted in November 2019, each presidential candidate has to run with